House to now adjourn. Rushanara Ali.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. Can I begin by extending my deepest condolences to Sir David Amos's family? He was a friend to us across the House. Mr. Deputy Speaker, in August we marked the 5th anniversary of the Burmese military's genocide against the Rohingya people. For the Rohingya, it has been 5 long years of pain, trauma, grief and displacement. 5 years in camps, far from their homes, families destroyed, robbed of their livelihoods, their education, their peace of mind, their futures. And for the perpetrators, the soldiers and the men who issued the orders, the heads of the Burmese military, it has been 5 years of evading justice for their crimes. So I want to begin by thanking colleagues across this House and in the other House who have served in the all-party as members with me in the all-party parliamentary group on democracy in Burma, which is co-chaired by the Right Honourable Member for South West Surrey, who I'm grateful to for his support, and also the all-party group on the rights of the Rohingya. Both of these groups have the support of a number of parliamentarians in this House and in the House of Lords, including Baroness Cox, and of course to the former Member of Parliament for St Albans, who helped set up the all-party group on the rights of Rohingya after the genocide 5 years ago, Anne Main. I'm very grateful to the work that she has done in the past. After years of campaigning with hundreds of parliamentarians across this House, I am pleased that and welcome the decision, rather belatedly, but I'm grateful to ministers for confirming that the UK will intervene in the Gambia versus Myanmar International Court of Justice case to support international justice. I would have liked it to have happened sooner, as Britain is the penholder for Burma in the UN Security Council. But it's good to see the government supporting this case along with a number of other countries. I want to also thank the Burma campaign, which has been absolutely critical in supporting parliamentarians, not only in this country, in the US and elsewhere, to campaign on this very important issue, and a number of international NGOs. The list is extensive, but I want to name a few. The International Rescue Committee, which supported my visit to the camps in Cox's Bazar a few years ago, BRAC, Bangladesh Rural Advancement Corporation, which has thousands of its staff has been supporting people along with other international and national NGOs in Bangladesh after the displacement of 700,000 refugees during the genocide 5 years ago, and that country hosts now 1 million Rohingya refugees. And of course Save the Children, and a number of international NGOs. Refugees International, which supported my first visit to Rakhine State in 2013, and a number of others that supported subsequent visits to Cox's Bazar and Rakhine State in 2017. It is thanks to also the Rohingya community organisations, both here in this country and internationally, that this issue has been raised in the international media, but also in our parliament and parliaments across the world. But of course, it's been a challenge keeping the issue on the agenda, given what's going on around the world, given the many crises, sadly, that exist, that have been happening, not least the most recent challenge facing the Ukrainian people with the attacks, the conflict perpetrated by Russia. Mr. Deputy Speaker, I'm also pleased that ministers have announced that sanctions will be stepped up against those companies that are propping up the military dictatorship, including Star Sapphire Group of companies, International Gateways Group of Companies Limited, and Sky One Construction Company Limited. I welcome, too, the government's commitment in principle to bring the Burmese military to the International Criminal Court. In answer to my written question on 23rd September, the Minister of State, the member for Hereford and South Herefordshire, stated, "The UK is clear that there must be accountability for the atrocities committed in Myanmar. We condemn the continuing grave human rights violations by the Myanmar military, as well as historic atrocities against the Rohingya. The UK is supportive in principle of any attempts to bring these issues before the International Criminal Court, where they can be scrutinised." But unfortunately, he goes on to say that the government remains resistant to convening the Security Council to refer the case to the International Criminal Court because of, and I quote, insufficient support amongst Security Council members. I understand the challenges, but it's not good enough. As I said earlier, Britain is the penholder in the UN Security Council when it concerns Burma, Myanmar. So it is imperative on our government to take a leadership role in the international community to build that alliance, build that consensus so that a referral can be made so that we can make further progress in seeking and achieving justice for the Rohingya people who have faced genocide. Mr. Deputy Speaker, even in the months since the military coup on the 1st of February 2021, the military has stepped up attacks in ethnic areas including Chin, Karenni and Karen State, including the torching of villages, murder of children and burning people alive. The international community must speak out with one voice and prove the strength of its collective institutions by bringing the Myanmar military regime to justice. There's more we can do right now. And that requires, in order to do so, that requires leadership from our government, building on what's been achieved so far. It is unfortunately shameful that the British government has drastically reduced its aid to the Rohingya refugees over the last few years. For the 2021 to 2022 financial year, British aid to the camps was reduced, being 45% of the previous financial year, and a reduction of 67%, Mr. Deputy Speaker, on the financial year before that. The need in the camps have not reduced, it has grown. I'll give way.
I'm very grateful to my honourable friend for giving way. It is on that very point. We can endlessly debate here the iniquities and the terrible experience that is, the Rohingya people are experiencing over a number of years. And she and I worked together when we were on the Westminster Foundation of Democracy to try and further the support of the UK government to that. But in the end, it's money that counts. And if there have been these enormous cuts in international aid and therefore a total cut in the support to the Rohingya refugees, does she not agree with me that that is simply not good enough and it ought to be something that the government rectifies with urgency? They've said they're not cutting in their public expenditure. Let them put it where it's needed most.
I couldn't agree more with my honourable friend. It's absolutely vital that the government reverses those cuts in the camps, because it cannot be right that the country that is hosting the largest number of refugees, Bangladesh, is left to deal with this situation with much less funding. And also it cannot be right that the internally displaced camps in Myanmar, where there is a desperate need for support, are having far less funding, and those NGOs that have got access are desperately struggling to cope with the need and the demands of the refugees that is required in order to address the problems that they face. Mr. Deputy Speaker, I will never forget the experience of hearing the stories of what happened to those refugees that I visited in Rakhine State in 2013 and 2017, where there are heavy restrictions on aid agencies and how they operate, and despite that they have been making heroic efforts to support those who have been forced into those camps because of the denial of citizenship rights, because of the persecution, because of the atrocities committed by the Burmese military over a number of years, including in 2012 and subsequently in the following so-called clear-out operations. I will never forget. I'll give way to my honourable friend.
I'm very grateful to my honourable friend, and I'm sure all will join me in congratulating her for her tireless efforts in not only raising the plight of the Rohingya, but in continuing to seek for justice of one of the most persecuted people of this, certainly of the last few decades. Does my honourable friend agree with me, and she's absolutely right, making an excellent speech, that the reality remains and the fact is that 5 years on we still have 1 million people in a refugee camp. 5 years on, the international community is yet to give the 58% of the overall commitment they made, and 5 years on we still have the Burmese military roaming free from any consequences. The international community surely must come together, give the aid that they've pledged, and bring justice for the Rohingya people.
Thank you. My Honourable makes very important points about the need to provide support as well as the need for justice. And I'm grateful to him and colleagues across the House for all the support they've given over the years. And it couldn't have, the progress that's been made so far on the justice dimension could not have been achieved if we didn't mobilise together as parliamentarians. And what I've seen is parliamentarians working at their best, showing their best side on this very important campaign. As a result, I think the Minister will acknowledge, as a result, the UK government's position has shifted. There had been considerable resistance over the years, and it is thanks to the efforts of colleagues across the House and both Houses of Parliament. We were the first group of parliamentarians to call for the Burmese military to be referred to the International Criminal Court all those years ago. And I'm also very pleased to see that the President Biden's administration has led the way in making clear that they will support a referral to the International Criminal Court on this very important issue. Returning back, Mr. Deputy Speaker, to the humanitarian situation, I will never forget the trauma described by women in the Cox's Bazar camp that I visited twice now, of being raped in front of their fathers, of seeing fathers describing the killings of their sons while they witnessed it. The trauma of that experience that they now have to live with, they've had to live with, without any support. So, as well as material support, which has been reduced over the last few years by our government, there's very little psychological support, and where there is, it's been phenomenal in terms of the support. That's how that support has helped women, men and children. And I will never forget the trauma faced by girls and boys of what they experienced during the genocide, and the double catastrophe of having to live in camps in Rakhine State, where their physical movement is limited, where their access to food is limited, where their access to resources is so limited that Muslim women weren't even able to find headscarves or be able to access sanitary products or many other basic things that they needed. And of course the shortage of food and other essential goods. And I will never forget the way in which girls and boys were struggling, teenage boys and girls, because they don't have access to education in the camps, because of restrictions in both countries. I have seen the suffering firsthand in those camps. The pandemic, of course, made matters worse, ravaging through camps despite the heroic efforts of NGOs, putting even more strain on stretched resources. And in February the 1st, the Myanmar military coup has made it even more unlikely for the Rohingya people to return to their rightful homes to Myanmar. When Rohingya people see the same men in charge in Myanmar, they see their torturers, their murderers, their rapists. The United Nations Joint Response Plan for the Rohingya refugee camps is only 30% funded for 2022, yet there will be a need for support in years to come. I would urge the Minister to revisit the UK government's decision to cut funding to the Rohingya refugees and ensure that the cuts that have been made are reversed, because it cannot be right that they are put in an even more perilous position than they already are. And I hope he can respond to that. Mr. Deputy Speaker, given the static situation, the Rohingya face with little hope of a speedy return to their country. What else can we do to help? I mentioned earlier that the generation of Rohingya are denied an education. And as I pointed out in 2018 in a debate here in this House, over half the population of refugees, Rohingya refugees in Bangladesh, are children. For those children and teenagers in the camps, education has been disrupted and is sporadic, to say the least. Many don't have access to education at all. Schools and lessons have been closed down. During the pandemic, they were set back even more. I would urge all those responsible parties, aid agencies, local authorities and the international community to come together to support those children and families, particularly young people who need education in the camps, as well as other resources to survive and cope with the ongoing situation there. In my recent visit earlier this year in Cox's Bazar, I was amazed to see the tireless work of the NGOs, but also officials, British diplomats and those who are leading the way in supporting the distribution of aid, and who are trying desperately to make ends meet, to support people who are in the camps with much limited resources. What is profoundly clear is that teenagers have got the least resources in terms of access to education and other resources, and that is potentially extremely dangerous. We need to make sure that the next generation of Rohingya people are able to get an education while they wait to eventually return home. And I invite the Minister to address these issues, and I hope that he will continue to work with the relevant agencies and governments in order to make sure this happens. Mr. Deputy Speaker, I mentioned sanctions and the welcome expansion of sanctions by the UK government to choke off the supply of cash and materials to the military regime. I'll give way.
First of all, commend the Honourable Lady for Bethnal Green and Bow for bringing this matter to the House, and congratulate her on her dogged perseverance on behalf of the Rohingyas in relation to persecution and discrimination. The Honourable Lady has mentioned sanctions. The military continues to make vast profits through the destruction of religious minorities and crushing political opposition. Lands and assets have been seized from victims as the regime looks to hide this money abroad. Jade and rubies have become the new blood diamonds as these are exported in vast quantities. So would the Honourable Lady agree that more action is needed to prevent Myanmar's military profiteering from these human rights abuses and hiding this money on international markets? This government and the Minister needs to act at that directly.
I couldn't agree more with the Honourable Gentleman, because unless we have robust sanctions building on what's been done so far, the Myanmar military will continue to act with impunity, and that's very much what's happened. And they will continue to profit from their abuses of power and be rewarded for the military coup that they instigated and successfully retook the country altogether away from the democratically elected leader of that country, Aung San Suu Kyi. A recent UN report on the implementation of the recommendations of the fact-finding mission on Myanmar showed there is so much more we can do on sanctions. I hope the Minister can address the reasons why the government hasn't fully implemented the recommendations in that report. We acted swiftly and resolutely against Putin's Russia in relation to the Ukrainian conflict. We have much to learn from the interventions that have been made and the international coordination and cooperation that has gone on. So why not in relation to Myanmar, given what's happened in that country and given the appalling actions of the military against not only the Rohingya population, other minorities and in light of the military coup, the entire population, where thousands have been killed in that country since the military coup. The military has targeted minority groups, has targeted the Rohingya, committed genocide, but they've now targeted the entire nation. Many state-owned enterprises, like as has been mentioned, like the number 2 mining enterprise, which gets profits from rare earths, has not yet been sanctioned by the government. The important thing about sanctions is that they must be internationally coordinated, or else sanction busters like water will always find cracks. But it requires leadership, and that's where our government can take the lead. For the Rohingya who remain in Myanmar, life is unimaginably hard. An apartheid-like regime of ethnic separation, routine human rights abuses, violence and murder. The UN Security Council must convene and pass a resolution under Chapter 7, which would establish targeted economic sanctions and establish an arms embargo. Those states supplying weapons used to kill civilians must be stopped now. Russia, Serbia, China. That requires leadership by our government, that requires international cooperation. As Tom Andrews, the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Human Rights in Myanmar, reported in February, stopping the junta as atrocity crimes begins with blocking their access to weapons. The more the world delays, the more innocent people, including children, will die in Myanmar. The longer the delay, the more graves the people of Myanmar will be digging. So my last question to the Minister is this. What conversations has he had, or his colleague has had, with our international partners to coordinate the sanctions effort, to make it genuinely supranational, to hit the regime where it hurts? The Burmese military's genocide against the Rohingya stands as one of the greatest crimes against humanity in recent times, and it's not over. Villages torched, children and babies killed, women raped and murdered, people set on fire, 1 million people forced from their homes. All of this documented by the United Nations. And of course, this genocide was also fueled by the use of modern technology and social media. Namely, as the UN fact-finding mission pointed out, Facebook played a determining role in that genocide. 5 years on, and the Rohingya are no nearer to justice, no closer to home, no hope of a settled, stable life, which is all they want. We will be here in 5 years' time. Will we be here in 5 years' time, still talking about aid to the camps and the need for sanctions? Surely the answer, Mr. Deputy Speaker, must be no.
Minister.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Deputy Speaker, and I'm very pleased to be able to respond today. And I thank the Honourable Member for Bethnal Green and Bow for calling this debate, and for speaking movingly of her experience, reflective of her long-standing interest in this issue, for which the House is grateful. And I should say that in preparation for this debate today, Mr. Deputy Speaker, I have liaised with Lord Ahmed, the Noble Lord Ahmed of Wimbledon, the Minister of State with responsibility for South Asia. And I would like again to thank the Honourable Member for Bethnal Green and Bow and her colleagues on the all-party group, and we acknowledge the importance of their work over a number of years in raising the prominence of this issue and correctly pushing for an active policy response. And I was grateful today for also the contributions from the Chamber by the Honourable Members for Barking and Bradford East. Now, Mr. Deputy Speaker, it has been over a year and a half since the Myanmar armed forces seized power in a coup in that country, and we must be very clear that they continue to inflict acute suffering on the people of Myanmar. The country is plunging ever deeper into political, economic and humanitarian crisis, and the consequences for regional stability and security are very clear. The Myanmar armed forces continue their brutal campaign of violence against civilians, with many of the same hallmarks of the terrible atrocities committed against the Rohingya in 2016 and 17. And the recent airstrike on a school, which killed at least 11 children, was an abhorrent reminder of the nature of the military regime. And I should say at this point, in response to the Honourable Lady's questions, we are targeting sanction at the military's access to finance and arms, including targeted sanctions on gems and timber, and we have worked and continue to work closely with partners in the US, Canada and EU at tightening that sanctions regime to hit them where it hurts. Mr. Deputy Speaker, more than 14 million people are now in need of humanitarian assistance, a staggering 30 million increase since the coup, and this makes the situation in Myanmar one of the world's largest humanitarian crises. Over the last financial year, the UK government has given more than £49 million in assistance to support humanitarian needs, as well as healthcare, education and civil society, and more than half of that money is being spent to tackle the humanitarian crisis, particularly in the border regions, including, of course, support to the Rohingya communities in Rakhine State. Approximately 600,000 Rohingya remain in Rakhine State, almost a quarter of whom have been confined to camps for the past decade. And, of course, we are now 5 years on from the horrific violence and trauma the Rohingya community suffered in 2017. And sadly, there continues to be no sign of a durable solution to the Rohingya refugee crisis. And of course, we are particularly concerned by the renewed violence in Rakhine State over the last month. Rohingya communities are caught up in fighting between the armed forces and the Arakan army, which, as members will know, is an ethnic Rakhine armed organisation. And therefore, humanitarian access is blocked by the military regime, leaving nearly 250,000 people in need. Rohingya communities who have been stripped of their citizenship and denied freedom of movement have been caught in the crossfire, with many trying to flee to safety. So the UK government is clear. This violence must stop immediately. All civilians must be protected. Humanitarian access must be restored, and Rohingya communities must be enabled to return to Myanmar from neighbouring countries in a safe, voluntary and dignified way. Now, when it comes to our support, Mr. Deputy Speaker, which was a topic under discussion, since 2017, the United Kingdom has provided £340 million worth of support to the Rohingya and neighbouring countries in Bangladesh. We have also provided £25 million for the Rohingya and other Muslim countries in Rakhine State, and this is paid for life-saving food, water, shelter, healthcare and protection. And we continue to be a major global donor to the United Nations humanitarian agencies, providing £108 million this year, which enables them to respond to this crisis, including when it affects young people and children. And one of our key partners is, of course, UNICEF, that attends to those particularly in need, children and young adults. And to address my honourable colleague's question directly, we remain committed to increasing our humanitarian support back to 0.7 of GNI when fiscal constraints allow. And we have been very clear all along about that. But of course, we are operating under some constraints. But overall, Mr. Deputy Speaker, the UK's government total portfolio of support makes us one of the largest bilateral humanitarian donors to the Rohingya response. And we will continue to provide support until the Rohingya are able to return to Myanmar, as well as to local communities around the camps in Bangladesh. And of course, we will continue to work alongside the international community to provide conditions for the Rohingya in Myanmar and mitigate the risk of further atrocities. And of course, this, as I've mentioned, includes targeted sanctions and building a global coalition of countries committed to tackling the flow of arms into that country. Now, of course, Mr. Deputy Speaker, this year has marked the 5th anniversary of the atrocities committed by the Myanmar armed forces against the Rohingya people. We mark this by pressing for accountability for the atrocities in Rakhine State, and we have not forgotten what happened. And last month, the United Kingdom announced, as the Honourable Lady mentioned, a further round of sanctions to target businesses with close links to the Myanmar armed forces who funded the clearance operation of 2017. We want to hold those responsible to account. We believe it's crucial for ending the violence and the misery suffered by the Rohingya. In August, the UK government announced our intention to intervene at the ICJ, International Court of Justice, case that was mentioned by the Honourable Lady, which has been brought by the Gambia regarding Myanmar's obligations under the Genocide Convention. And we believe that is the best form of holding those responsible to account. She mentioned this. She also referred to the ICC. Of course, we support attempts to bring these issues before the ICC, but our judgment is that a referral from the Security Council would not at this stage be the most efficacious way of doing that, and it may inadvertently afford comfort to Myanmar's military. So our belief is the best vehicle for holding those perpetrators of these terrible atrocities to account is through the International Court of Justice and the case brought by Gambia, and we'll be energetic in terms of our intervention in support of that case. So, Mr. Deputy Speaker, yes, of course, delighted.
I thank the Minister for his response and wanted to find out a bit more about, if he could say a bit more about what is being done to build that international alliance, to ensure that that the ICC referral route is pursued at some point. And in the only way to do that is if the UK, as the lead, actually works to build that alliance. It's not going to happen without that effort. And also, what exactly is the UK government doing to support the ICJ case led by the Gambia? Can the Minister be specific about having expressed support about what exactly the government's doing?
We certainly hope that the ICC, the International Criminal Court, will at some point be a forum for holding these crimes to account. And we will continue to use our diplomatic network very energetically to build a foundation for one day arriving at that point. We think on that journey that our contribution to the ICJ case will be very significant. What we bring to that is tremendous legal firepower and an ability to add real strength to that case that's been brought by the Gambia. So we hope that our alliance and our legal firepower will be a very effective and important intervention in that, and that may lay the foundation for further legal activity and possibly in the longer term some movement in the International Criminal Court. Now, Mr. Deputy Speaker, to achieve true justice for Rohingya, their citizenship in Myanmar must be restored. The systematic human rights violations they have suffered for decades must end, and Rohingya people must be meaningfully included in future visions of Myanmar society. Humanitarian assistance cannot solve that political element of this crisis, and we need to look to the future and work to create the conditions that will allow the Rohingya to return to Myanmar voluntarily, safely, and with dignity when the situation allows. And we therefore continue to engage with a range of partners, both globally and in the region, to encourage dialogue, to find peaceful resolution to the crisis, and to support, fundamentally, Mr. Deputy Speaker, a return to democracy. And we will use all available opportunities, including at the G7 and with our ASEAN partners, to push for a long-term solution to the crisis at its root cause. And we will also use our role as penholder to keep the situation in Myanmar on the UN Security Council's agenda and explore all available Council tools. The Rohingya crisis remains a top priority for this government, therefore, Mr. Deputy Speaker, and we will continue to do all we can to ensure that the Rohingya can voluntarily, safely and sustainably return home when conditions allow, and to ensure that all people in Myanmar can live safely and in peace. And I would like to reiterate my thanks to the Honourable Lady for Bethel Green and Bow for calling this debate, and to the ongoing efforts of all parliamentarians to engage and support this incredibly important issue. Thank you.
I'm going to say, as somebody who's been to Cox's Bazar myself and seen the appalling consequences of the persecution of the Rohingya, how privileged I am to have chaired today's Adjournment Debate.